Do you ever feel like life is meaningless? Well, you're in luck because so does the Bible. It turns out the Bible says everything is meaningless. And today, we're going to take a look at exactly what that means. This is the Existential Stoic podcast. I'm Randy. That's Danny. What's going on, Danny?
What's up, Randy?
Yeah, so pretty interesting. I've been reading through the Bible over the past year, and this episode is not meant uh to anger anyone. We're just talking about what the Bible actually says and then open to interpretation. But I was reading through it, and I was actually blown away that in Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, right after Proverbs, which is full of wisdom, chock full of wisdom, the first chapter of Ecclesiastes is called Everything is Meaningless. And I was like, whoa, this is like existential.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I remember, just on a side, when I teach an honors course on the Bible, and I remember we used to, we do put in our syllabus, we put that this is like the course is meant to be like a literary study of it, literary and philosophical, because we had a problem where students would come in thinking like it was a course about like the Bible in the sense of like Christian faith or something, or Judeo-Christian faith, and like they never actually read it. Even though they had all these views of the Bible, they never actually carefully read it. And it's interesting when you read it because it's got some really interesting stuff in there and a lot of stuff I think that overlaps with like a lot of philosophical ideas and things that people would be surprised to find in the Bible.
That's what I've been getting in reading through it. Like I've read through it once when I was 18, but I think I was too young to kind of grasp what I was reading. And now
Yeah,
that
makes
I'm
sense.
over double that age, it's like I'm reading it and I'm like, wow, this is chock full of wisdom. So I guess what we'll do is we'll read a little bit from Ecclesiastes 1 for maybe people who haven't read it themselves. And then you can find it for free online if you want to read it yourself. But I just found it really, really
It's not hard to
interesting.
find a copy.
Yeah. I found it really, really interesting that it has a whole chapter called Everything is Meaningless. And these are the words of the teacher, King David's son, who ruled in Jerusalem. So I believe that's meant to say this is from Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived in the Bible, which is pretty crazy. And he says everything is meaningless. He says everything is meaningless, says the teacher, completely meaningless. What do people get for all their hard work under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. The sun rises and the sun sets, then hurries around to rise again. The winds blow south and then turn north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows out again to the sea. Everything is wearisome beyond description. No matter how much we see, we're never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we're not content. And it just goes on to say that, you know, everything keeps on going. We don't remember what happened in the past, and in the future generations, no one will remember what we're doing now. Pretty crazy. It's all meaningless. Everything
Well,
that's meaningful is meaningless.
this was a guy in contemporary terms having an existential crisis. And you know what though? You know what I actually like about the section is like if you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? We think we're doing all this valuable stuff now. We think because we're subjects experiencing the world, right? We think the world revolves around us. We think we're doing so much, it's so important. And the reality is we're gonna die and eventually it'll all be forgotten. Sure, some people might be remembered, but how they're remembered is going to be heavily dictated by the people writing that story later on and the pieces that they want to highlight, right? It's going to be a very, sketchy kind of remembrance. It's not going to be like your life's remembered verbatim or anything. And I think this is, something a lot of people do struggle with, that we go to work every day. We do all these things. We're trying to build a life. We're trying to do all this. And for what? What does it amount to?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting how towards the end of that he said, in future generations we're all going to die and no one's going to remember. It sounded very, very much like Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And so here we go, having Solomon, the wisest man who's ever lived, and Marcus Aurelius, probably like the Elon Musk plus some of his age, saying that like we're all going to die and it amounts to nothing. Like, how about that for life?
Not to mention, I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap with like, you see Camus and like the myth of Sisyphus here too, this idea of like, that endless labor for nothing, pushing that boulder up the
Mm.
mountain, that it's all like life is really like, you know, we we want to convince ourselves this hugely important, hugely, meaningful journey. And the reality is it's not. And the funny thing is too, if you think about it, like eventually, right? Eventually, I'm talking about way in the future, the sun's going to explode, the earth's going to be gone, and humanity, once humanity is gone, guess what? The story of humanity does not matter anymore. right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
when you think about us in terms of the cosmos, in terms of, and I like what they said too about like the earth, the river, and all, because geological time is so stretched out and human time is so condensed that when you look at our lives over geological time, it means nothing, you know? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting.
Yeah, it's crazy how short a period of time that it is. Um, there's another thing that I want to read in here too, because I really have to recommend. Like, I don't recommend reading too many things, especially books that are garbage. Like, I'll never tell anybody to read The Scarlet Letter, but
I
I
trash
think
it all the time.
I think that people can learn, or I'll just say, I don't think people can learn anything unless they want to. But I myself have learned a lot from reading Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Like, these are two sections that I'm just like, wow, this is pretty incredible stuff that's in here. So,
You know what? I would take that a step further and say too, just real quick, like I studied world religions, I studied mythology, and I think there's so much packed in those stories. And I don't read them. I'll be honest, I don't believe in any specific faith, so I read them for, the value that they have in terms of possible knowledge, wisdom, and interesting stories. And they're all really interesting. They're all worth reading because they're a lot of fun. They
mhm.
are. You can learn so much. Plus, a lot of our sayings come from it, which is interesting.
Yeah, and all the stories that come from the Bible is crazy.
Oh yeah. Oh
When
yeah.
I was reading the Old Testament, I was like, I know this story. Hang on, this one sounds familiar. How do I know this
Yeah.
story too? Oh, man. Anyways, so Ecclesiastes 2 is the futility of pleasure. And this is just awesome because we have this misconception that, having pleasures in life and avoiding pain is the good life. And that's what's going to make everything great. Like, when I get that house or that car or that spouse or that amount of money or that job or that vacation or the Instagram influencer status, whatever the heck it is, when I get that thing, then my life will be good. So, again, quoting the wisest man who's ever lived, he says, I collected great sums of silver and gold, the treasure of many kings and provinces. I hired wonderful singers, both men and women, and had many beautiful concubines. I had everything a man could desire. But I looked at everything I had worked so hard to accomplish. It was all so meaningless, like chasing the wind. There was really nothing worthwhile anywhere.
It's a good one because I think anybody who's chased pleasure or anybody who's chased, I mean, especially like, you can chase pleasure in extremes with addiction. You can chase pleasure, with like purchasing stuff, whatever. Anybody who's chased pleasure, I think realizes at some point that it's a losing game, that you never can, that essentially like every pleasure is harder to hit that point where you
Mm,
once were, right? The first time's always the best, and then it's always going to be a downhill slide from there. It's like people that like cure their depression or something by shopping, right? They end up getting these like huge debt because they keep buying stuff because the things become more and more meaningless over time, right? You just have more and more attachment. The pleasure's harder and harder to get, and it just gets worse and worse because I think you're not dealing with your real issues, right? You're not finding what's really working for you.
dude, the pleasure of the first bite of pizza gets me every single time. It's like,
Yeah, it's so
you
good.
think about having pizza, your mouth starts watering. You order the pizza, it takes like half an hour to get here. You finally get the pizza, you open the box, it looks so delicious. You take that slice, first bite is incredible, and then you keep on eating, wanting more of that first bite, and it's already gone.
It's kind of the nature of it though, right? It's like it's always going to be the best because that's the threshold where you want it the most. So the pleasure is going to be the highest, but now you've already had it. So naturally the pleasure is going to wane with each passing bite, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so here's something else that I got from here that I thought was really interesting. So he's talking about how all of this stuff is meaningless and how basically all this work that he's done and all this toil and wisdom and fools and all this stuff, how it's all just meaningless. And he kind of summarizes that, so I decided there's nothing better than to enjoy food and drink and to find satisfaction in work. How about that?
Hmm. Well, I think it gives you this. Yeah, I think any of these thinkers who reach a point of realizing that one, I mean, by realizing everything's meaningless, you're realizing we're meaning makers, right? So we're creating the meaning, and you're realizing that because of that, it's all meaningless. There's no objective meaning to anything, right? And you see this in all the existentialists really hit on this too. You see this in a lot of the Stoics reach this point at some point. And I think once you reach that point, the question is, well, where do you go from here? because you have choices, right? You either have like, I mean, Nietzsche highlighted this the best where you have nihilism, which is you hit that point and you stay there where everything is just meaningless, nothing has value, and you trudge along. Or you try to overcome it, right? You try to find something that works for you, find something that gives you enough value to keep going, that makes life worthwhile, but it's going to look different than all that stuff before that you believe would have meaning, you know? And that everybody tells us have meaning, right? Because society constantly is telling us. I mean, look at our society, getting new things, being out in the sun with beautiful people, drinking Coca-Cola, all these things, are going to make you happy. All these simple pleasures. And the reality is like, they're not. I mean, that's not what life is about. Yeah,
Hmm.
sure, they're a part of life. And, you definitely want to have I think all of us want to have pleasure and comfort in our lives. That's fine, but like that's not going to make your life meaningful. That in and of itself.
Hmm. Yeah, and I when he said enjoy food and drink and find satisfaction in your work, I thought that was really interesting because it's like no matter what you do, you're always going to have to work. Like pretty much, almost everybody
You're
is
also going
always
to have
going
to
to have
eat
to
and
work.
drink.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so like eating and drinking is something you're going to have to do every day, and that's cool because it kind of relates to that pizza thing that I was talking about with the eating and drinking. Because like when you're really hungry, you can really enjoy that first bite of food, and you can do that every day. Like there are some
Yeah.
monks who only eat like once a day. And so imagine how much they must look forward to that every day. And you can enjoy that and savor that every single day. And then same
Well, I
thing
think it
with
was the. Oh, go ahead. So I was going to say the Buddhists used to when they used to go around and beg, they would only eat what they were given. So
mm-hmm,
think about that, right? You're waiting so long, and then you're really enjoying everything, and everything given to you is from someone who, they might not have money either. So they're giving you maybe a little bit of rice or something, but you're thankful and grateful for it because without it you would starve, right? So you really look
mm-hmm,
at these things. I think it really shines a light on the fact that, our perspective changes how we look at things. And we have control over that if we wish. We can let ourselves slide into like the false meanings and false values and things that society kind of throws at us, or we can really like look at things, I think, more honestly and see that we have some control over the meaning of things, and then start to really like, embrace what's really valuable for us. Yeah.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and also with the work thing, because we're gonna spend the majority of our waking hours of our life working. And it's like, do you I'm always shocked when people hate their jobs. Like I granted, I hated my job for a while, but I was also actively changing my career. So like that's one thing to hate your job and use it as motivation to get out of it. But the people who've
You're
been doing the
using it as,
same
yeah, it's
thing
a
for
stepping stone.
yeah, people who've been doing
Yeah.
the same thing for 20 years and hate every aspect of it, and it's just like, why are you wasting all of your life doing this?
Well, I think this is it, right? Is that, if everything's meaningless, it's also recognizing our control and our effective power as agents to change things, right? And to change things so that we find some meaning and satisfaction in what we're doing. And I do like that idea because, work is a sort of, I think, an important area in life where a lot of people find purpose, meaning, worth, value, self-satisfaction, right? Self-worth, dignity, because it feels you're earning some living, you're doing things, you're creating things. It feels good, but it has to be something that you actually want to do. It has to be something you're
Yeah.
interested in. You might not get it right the first time. You might do like what a lot of people do and listen to the outside world, listen to your parents, listen to everybody else, and choose your career based on that. And you might get it wrong. That's okay. You can switch it,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to take that. You have to take that step and do it.
Yeah. So we've heard what the Bible says about meaning in life, or at least what I mean, there are other parts of the Bible that talk about how life has meaning, I'm sure.
I
But
mean, they get pretty straight about objective truth at certain points. So yeah, yeah.
yeah. But we're not talking about that today because I didn't read that recently so clearly. I just forgot it. But
Plus, we're in
what
Old
does
Testament still, so
I know, right? I do enjoy the New Testament because it's very like full of hope, and I do enjoy
Well, you
that.
get a huge transition from one to the other. You go from
Mm-hmm.
like tribal God to universal. It's very different, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
it's awesome. Uh, and so, what do the existentialists and the Stoics believe about meaning?
Well, I think it's interesting. The existentialists, I think you could there are a lot of differences, but to kind of make it short, I guess what you could
Mm-hmm.
say is, they all kind of do share the same point of view in the fact that like they recognize that we are meaning makers, and because of that, right? everything can have a different meaning depending on how we look at it. The meaning we give it is the meaning it has. There was actually, who was it? It was a pre-Socratic, or no, a sophist, Pythagoras, I think. No, maybe. He said, forget the name now, but he said, man is the maker of all things, of things that are that they are, of things that are not that they are not, right? That idea that like we measure everything, we evaluate everything, we assign value. And that goes both ways. But once you realize that, you realize that all of this is a construct, right? Like society could be totally different. Our values could be totally different. That's fine. So once you realize that there is no objective truth, so it's up to us to assign value. And then so it's up to each individual. This is where authenticity comes in, right? It's up to each individual to find the authentic life. Which life has the most meaning, the most value for that person? And it might be different for each of us in different ways. And I always like that because I think like it frees us up to live our best life, to pursue what really interests us, and to be strong enough to be unique, to stand outside the crowd, to not conform. Because I think a lot of people lose themselves in trying to conform with others, chasing the Joneses, doing all that, and they live their life doing that, and they're unhappy and miserable because they've never actually assigned value themselves.
Mm.
You know?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I was gonna ask, like, I'm sure there are some people listening who are like, yeah, but it's not up to me. Like the society makes the meaning of the world, and I have to follow that. And it's like, well, maybe that's true, but maybe thinking that you have to
But
follow it isn't
there's
true.
also cases of people, absolutely going against the societal values and trying to change the whole system. I mean, yes, it's hard. Look at Martin Luther King. Look at people like that, who tried to recognize something wrong and tried to shift the whole thing, right? Because they saw that there was something wrong with how we treated each other or something. I think, that's a big part of it is kind of moving beyond the superficial and trying to see what really matters to you. What, I think Kierkegaard said, he said the most important, this is not verbatim, he said like the most important thing I need to do is find the idea for which I'm willing to live or die.
Mhm.
And what is that thing that's going to give my life meaning, that I'm willing to live or die for, that like is the center of my reality that gives me purpose.
Mm.
Nietzsche, I think he leaned heavily into like personal achievements, right? Like work, essentially, like finding some project that really validates your existence, that really makes existence worthwhile, that you feel like you have to do, right? For him, that was getting out, his philosophy and stuff. And I think you see kind of something similar in the Stoics, right? Whereas, eudaimonia is achieved through virtue and through, realizing our character. And that for them is the meaning of life, right? Is achieving that. So it's not about all this like pleasures, all these little things. Like Marcus Aurelius is a great example. He could have had anything. He was like the top of the pyramid, right? I mean, of the Roman Empire. So he could have had whatever he wanted, yet he was pretty humble. He was on the front lines with his soul. I mean, he went out in battle and stuff. He thought about death all the time because he realized like none of that stuff matters at the end. You're not going to take, you can have those experiences, but you're not going to take all that crap with you to the grave. And all
Mm.
those pleasures are fleeting. So what really is going to matter, what really matters to you long term, or what really matters to you in terms of like, your self-worth. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, that is very interesting. Hmm. That's a lot to digest.
Yeah, it is. I just said a
Hmm.
lot.
Yeah, definitely.
I think,
Oh,
I mean, honestly, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
so when you were talking, I was thinking that like just the meaning that we associate with pleasure and pain. Because on a very, very base level,
Oh, yeah.
I was thinking that like with pleasure, I associate wanting more. And with pain, I associate avoiding it at all costs. But like oftentimes it's counterintuitive that I should be kind of going towards pain and I should be kind of avoiding pleasure. Because like a lot of, especially these instantaneous, like instant gratification type pleasures, these ones are really dangerous. And the pains that I feel right now, a lot of times are kind of good.
Well, what's funny too is pleasure and pain are like, I always think of them as like a rudimentary valuation system, right? That we have initially because like, if I touch something hot and it burns me, I shouldn't go near hot things, right? That pain is a
Mm-hmm.
recognition that that's bad, right?
Yeah.
But, we can also be conditioned to think of things as painful that are actually good for us. I always use an example in class. Like imagine like a kid who like, every time he goes home from school, his parents are like, you gotta do your homework before you watch TV or do anything else or go on your phone. So homework becomes a chore and a pain before the pleasure of TV and phone. And so what happens is learning becomes painful. Any
Mm.
type of work like that becomes painful, and what's seen as the reward is, just staring at the TV, playing on your phone, right? And if you think about that, so you can be conditioned to feel that way, or you can be conditioned to feel that, learning is fun, it's exciting, it's good for you, it's healthy, right? It's challenging, true, but like, not a bad thing. I think this is also where like Nietzsche talks a lot about, flipping our view of suffering. Instead of looking at it as something bad, looking at it as a way to overcome ourselves, to grow, you know.
Could you imagine if the kid got home and the parents were like, now you got to watch your TV and play on your phone before you can do your homework?
Yeah,
And
right.
he's like, oh, sure, I'm playing video games. Come on. Yeah, that is
But I
pretty
think it just
interesting.
comes down to like, the personal responsibility of being able to define what matters to us and taking
Hmm.
responsibility for our lives, what
Yeah.
makes them meaningful.
So what did you talk about Stoics and what they believe about meaning in life?
I think like I said a little bit, I think they mostly, eudaimonia was, the
Mm,
flourishing life is achieved through virtue, right? So
yeah.
for the Stoics, a lot of the things that we take to be pleasurable are going to be meaningless. They're going to be seen as fleeting. What matters most is character development. So your control, your growth as an individual, being a good member of the community, being a good member in your, being a good person generally is going
Uh-huh.
to have more value than anything else.
But there's also some like pleasure associated in that character development and
Oh
virtue,
yeah.
right? It's like the
Oh yeah.
virtuous cycle. Yeah.
Well, think of it, Aristotle, I think, said it really well in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he said, humans are rational by nature, right? So as we pursue virtue, it's naturally pleasing because we're realizing our nature. And I think the Stoics felt the same way, right? Our nature is to be rational, and virtue development is a realization of that. So it feels good, but it's a different kind of feels good than like, you know, the other pleasures we normally have because they're fleeting. This is more like that. I think that, a lot of philosophers agree on that, self growth has a stronger, longer lasting type of pleasure about it because you can look back and see your achievements. You carry that with you. So even when you face a difficult situation, you have all that stuff at the ready, right? Even though
Yeah.
you're likely to forget it, but you still
And
have it
it,
there.
and it's not like a guilty pleasure too. Like I just
No.
in my mind, I'm just comparing like eating a whole pizza, which is just like a guilty pleasure, or doing service work where I like fix something for someone or help somebody or clean something up for some like that. You may be exhausted at the end of it. It may not feel pleasurable, but then like you think about it and you just smile and you feel good inside. And it's completely the opposite of a
Yeah.
pizza where it felt really good initially and then you just feel like garbage.
Well, I think this is the thing, right? It's like, and I think that might have been part of what he's trying to say in the Bible section too, which is, society, we're taught all these simple things are pleasurable, all these things have meaning, but in the reality, they don't. And like, are we chasing the wrong thing? Are we chasing our tails instead of actually chasing what really does matter? Real growth, a better community, better lives, better selves, I mean, that might be really what we should be after.
Hmm.
And it's hard. It is hard because you're kind of like, the simple thing, it's so much easier to kind of like just like veg out and do nothing and
Or to
complain, right? And not take responsibility for things. Like it's so
yeah,
much easier to do that.
or to believe the teenage multimillionaire or something that like that's what it's all about because they buy a
Yeah.
freaking Bugatti before they even get their driver's license. Like it's like, oh man, if only that happened, my life would be awesome. And it's like,
Yeah.
Justin Bieber was
What
pretty
if it?
depressed. Eh.
Yeah. It might be, it might not. But that's the problem though. It might not. It depends, really. You
Mhm.
have so many, and I think it's funny because I think some of the people like you see all these people who have all this money and stuff, and I think the ones that are probably really happy are the ones you don't see all the time. The ones that aren't always in the news, because they're the ones that don't have problems. They're the ones that are living their life and probably find things that they enjoy.
Mhm. Yeah, because I can't imagine that. I don't know. I I don't think there are that many happy celebrities. It doesn't
No.
seem like there are. Like even
There's definitely some, but I think, yeah.
I read this book that it was called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. Really good book about like a therapist goes sees a therapist and writes about it. It's a really good book. But she was talking about how like one time she she like Facebook stalked one of her clients. And it was crazy because her client was like falling apart in therapy, like absolute mess. But her social media profile looked like she was the most powerful person on the planet. And she's like,
Yeah.
this should just be a lesson to anybody who thinks that anything online, any image online is actually a real representation of their life, because this person is literally falling apart, but everything online makes it look like their life is amazing.
Well, maybe that's the other lesson here, right? Is that tendency to want to present to the world this image that I'm doing better than everybody else, that my life's perfect. There's a certain sort of like, denial in reality there, right? And a certain sort of like desire to like you don't want anybody else in, and then you're not going to let anybody in. So, I think there is that.
Yeah.
It's a
Denial is not
curated
just
view,
a
right?
river in Egypt, so they say.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one.
Oh, you know what else I got? Okay, so we're going to get off topic just because a whole bunch of
That's
stuff
all
I
right.
want to talk
We
about
always
with
do.
you, anyways. So it was going through in there the 5 stages of grief, and granted, they're not applicable for like real grief because this was just done in a study with grief as to your own death. But it has a denial.
Did you know where those? Do you know where those 5 stages came from? They came from
Elizabeth
some nurse who
Kubler-Ross, she
studied.
was studying
Yeah,
people
yeah,
who
yeah,
were
there you go.
dying and accepting their own death,
Yeah,
their own mortality.
yeah,
So
yeah,
like,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it gets applied to like all types of grief, and people are like, somebody else died. You got to use these 5 stages, and it's like, well, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't work for that because you're not dying; they are. Well, at least you're not dying immediately. So anyway,
Yeah, they're dying right now.
yeah.
Yeah,
So here's something that I got, just a little like illumination moment. It has like denial and bargaining and all these other things. But the last one is acceptance. But the second to last one is depression. And this hit me because many times in life I have been considered depressed. And it always came right before things turned around. Like it didn't feel like it because sometimes the depression lasted for months and it just sucked. But it was always like right
yeah.
before things turned around. And maybe there was some acceptance there. But I was like, huh, that's like the penultimate step in dealing with grief. And it's like in my life, in my experience at least, that's been like the moment right before everything turns around. So could be
It's
interesting.
funny though. I've been diagnosed depressed many times, and I think to an extent you're right, right? Because I think depression is also an indication that you've hit that point where a change is going to happen or where a change is necessary, and your options are to turn back and go backwards or go forwards, right? And I think that's kind of what it is. Like that's like kind of realizing everything's meaningless. You've realized the truth of this construct. And now you have to face the reality. Do I go to nihilism? Do I stay there? Do I backtrack and pretend like everything's okay and deny it? Or do I try to find some other way? Do I assert my own values? Do I find what matters to me most and live a life that's of value to me? I think that's kind of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm so happy that there are so many good books. It's
It's helpful,
such a
isn't it?
delight,
Yeah.
right? I can't even imagine not reading.
Well,
It
what I love about, but it teaches you too. I think it's so easy to think that our experiences are so unique, and that this never happened to anybody else. They've never been a victim like me. They've never been depressed like me. They never had this experience. They've never had relationships like me. But books are a great way to realize that no, you probably pretty standard along human experience, right? Like a lot of people want this. If you just talk to somebody else, you'd realize it.
Mhm.
I think that's what's great about books. And you can talk to other people through books too. I think that's the other nice thing. You don't have to necessarily like, you talk to somebody. You are interacting with a person through them.
Okay, so here's another shocking thing that I wanted to go over with you. So we idolize these celebrities. Like a few weeks ago, I was talking about how I watched the Mr. Rogers movie with Tom Hanks, and like it makes him
Yeah.
into a saint, you know? And so like it's very easy to idolize these people that we see one aspect of their life. But like
Oh yeah.
I'm reading his biography, and so like it turns out that he was colorblind, which like sucks. Okay? So like you miss that whole aspect of life. But then here's another thing. Like he was never in his whole entire adult life he wore contacts. He was never able to put them in or take them out himself. Like could you imagine? Could you
Uh,
imagine Like having
Uh,
someone else put contacts in your eyes and take them out of your eyes every day for your life. Like, yes, he was a saint in many areas, or maybe not a saint, but like, yes, he was very patient with children and he was very good into children's development. And
he was a good person
he
in a lot of ways. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
but like everybody has their flaws.
But this is the thing about history, right? Is that we tend to gloss over all of that. And we tend to portray people in one way and hyperinflate that until they like he looks like a saint, right? Instead of looking at, and I think this is one of the biggest flaws we do. We make people out to be more than a person rather than keeping them a human being. I mean, look at like, when people talk about like the founders of America, they always make them out to be these like superhero-esque
You
figures.
think of
They were
George
all people.
Washington on the
Yeah,
front of that boat
yeah,
with like, you know?
yeah, leading the people across that little river or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like they did do that. That's great. And they did a lot of great things, but they also were people. They did a lot of terrible things. They also did a lot of things that were probably questionable. They also had a lot of struggles. But we make it out like they lived these lives where they had no burdens. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love Marcus Aurelius' meditations, because he's honest about it, at least within that meditations, about his personal struggles, and it makes him very human. And I think this is our biggest challenge, like, because you look at celebrities, we dehumanize them. We make them into these idols rather than into people. And that's where we lose that like fundamental connection, you know?
Mm-hmm. Another funny story. There was so he would always respond to all of his fan mail, and there was one kid who
Ugh,
was like,
man, it must have been a time.
"Oh yeah, it was crazy." There was one kid who was like, "Mr. Rogers, I don't think you poop because I see everywhere else in your house, but I don't see a bathroom. So, can you tell me, do you poop?" And he wrote the kid back. He's like, "Yes, I do poop just like everyone else. You know, not everything you see, or like, yeah, it was funny.
No, it's a TV show, right? But
Yeah.
kids think that's his like real house, which is funny too.
Mm-hmm.
But this
Yeah.
is it. I think it's funny, like a part of us never loses that like childhood like imagination where we just accept things. Like, when you're young, it's easy to accept Santa Claus. It's easy to accept you just accept these things because you see them and you don't question it. And then you get older, you question it, but then there's part of us that still doesn't question things, I think. And that's the other problem. Like you have to keep examining life. You
Mm-hmm.
have to keep like active in that respect too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So everything is meaningless. I guess the last thing that we could do for people that could be helpful is what do you do when you feel like everything is meaningless, aside from calling suicide prevention hotline?
If it's that far, yeah, definitely call that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, I would say stay active in questioning because that's a way that you find new meaning. That's a way that you uncover new truths in the world. And that's a way that you constantly reaffirm meaning, not these I think when we get lazy and we don't question the world, that's when that horrible cliff of meaninglessness can arrive.
Mm.
Because we live in a cave, like take the allegory of the cave, right? You're stuck in that cave. All of a sudden somebody breaks down the wall and everything falls apart all at once. Whereas if you stay active and you keep questioning, you're constantly challenging that. You're constantly pushing the boundary further out.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always new things to discover. You're never letting yourself get complacent.
That's a good one. And going on from that, I would say like stay active in terms of get some exercise, even if it's just a
Yeah,
brisk
that's
walk
also good.
outside. Spend time in nature because nature's like infinite in its like variety and everything. Whereas like we feel like there's infinite stuff on the internet, but it's really all just all the same over and over again. And then like you said, with like exploring new things, the whole explore exploit paradox, like
Yeah.
it's very easy. I'm guilty as anyone of getting stuck in this comfortable thing of things that I already know about and just doing them over and over and over again. And it's good to try new things because it can open up new possibilities you never would have thought about.
I also think the more we challenge ourselves, the more we find real value in our overcoming ourselves and
Mm-hmm.
realizing what we're capable of. So I think a lot of these philosophers are right. There's a lot of value in growth. There just is. Can be anything. It could be, exercising and pushing yourself in that way. It could be, solving new problems. It could be taking on new endeavors, just new experiences in general, traveling if you've never traveled, whatever. It could be anything. But proving yourself that you can do it,
Mm-hmm.
you know, showing yourself that you're possible. Even just, practicing like If you find yourself not being very patient, be patient, try to be patient, stuff like that. Just showing
Mhm.
yourself that you can and
Mhm.
not letting yourself get complacent. Because I
Yeah.
always find that that's one of the worst things. Whenever I feel depressed, I also get lethargic, and I don't want to do things. And I find that combination is dangerous.
Mhm. Definitely. So there you have it in a nutshell, why everything is meaningless and why it really doesn't even matter because we're all going to die anyways and nobody will remember us. So pretty awesome.
Yep. So don't worry about it. Actually, I mean, don't worry
Yeah,
about it. You're fine.
don't take it so seriously. It doesn't matter in the end. Uh,
It doesn't.
but anyways,
It's just
if you
life.
did enjoy this episode, make sure to share with friends and family. This is the Existential Stoic podcast. You can check us out on YouTube, also wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Randy. That's Danny. I'll see you later, Danny.
Later, Randy.